So, good evening, everybody. Good evening, everybody, again. For this, the first crash teleconference online. Because of the circumstances, we don't have an audience, but the idea of discussing with the authors that we enjoy doing, and so we decided to adopt this kind of setup, and we hope it's the last time they're going to have to revert to this. But from the starting with next year, we hope to have an audience back with us and continue, but also continue these conferences in streaming. And so I'm delighted to welcome Joël Glasman this evening. We were very enthusiastic to maintain this. We wanted to welcome Joël last spring, but obviously had to be cancelled because of the COVID. And so I would especially like to thank him for our invitation and to submit to this exercise with its constraints. Joël Glasman is an historian and Africanist. And he works at the University of Bayreuth in Germany, which is one of the biggest centers in African studies in Europe. And so we've never met one another physically, but we've met one another virtually on the occasion of interviewing for some of his articles and his book, and some of his articles being found in the book. And the book I can show you here, it's called Humanitarianism and the Quantification of Humanitarian Needs. Now, among the articles that he included in it, there was one particularly on the origin of the black, and a more recent article devoted on universality. And in the alternative journal, Humanitarian Alternatives, I invite you to consult it on the site to be able to read the entire article. More generally speaking, what we see is that Joël's work combines with the interest of the crash and the importance of numbers which are triggering humanitarian action more and more. And it's evidence-based information to be able to launch our operations. And what's important for us is to think about it, that what we deliver with helping without dying, talking about humanitarian security, which we published in 2016, where we asked the questions of the statistics of food insecurity, both in the building of these statistics and the way they're used. And more recently, the work we've also done on the MSF's operations in Borno, Nigeria, and we observed the thresholds of mortality, which are very much in the news today. And this evening, we are joining Joël in his questioning about the measuring the needs and how to measure them. This is one of the main preoccupations that we have with Joël and us, and so it seemed very useful for us to be able to begin a conversation. The book is occupied by the norms and the associations and the production of his thoughts. And so this journey, which we're inviting you on this evening, thank you again to Joël to play the game. I'll stop here, and I will do as usual. We will devote the first part of this conference to the presentation of Joël of his work. And then after that, I will invite the virtual audience to ask questions, with which Joël will then try to answer. And so, Joël, I'll give you the floor. With the first question, I'd like you to talk to us about your career and why, by what reason, and how do you went to Africa, the history of Africa, to the cacophony of humanitarian work. And also like you to talk about your method a little bit, your methodology, because you talk between the ethnographic approach, you see this in the book, with a more traditionally historical approach, historian approach on analyzing the archives. And so I'll give the floor to you, and thank you very much. In the archives, where I was faced with ethnography It's a topic, especially the anthropologists and the ethnologists have worked on for the past several years. Now, in the beginning, I hadn't really planned to work on this topic, but it's true that when you teach the history of Africa and do research on Africa, often we are faced with the figures and numbers, whether it's put by the humanitarians or the UNHCR or OCHA, and whence the interest, which I sort of happened upon to study this topic. And so this evening I'm going to try to show you some pictures. Do you see my screen which I've shared? The starting point of this work is the profusion of statistical indicators, figures, and thresholds to understand humanitarian needs. The weekly, monthly, annual reports of humanitarian organizations, thus filled with indicators of needs, presented with the form of figures, graphs, infographics, or maps. An example is the annual report of OCHA, the UN Office for Humanitarian Coordination, the Global Humanitarian Overview, and it's a report which is only made up of figures. Indicators. At the top of the report, you have the synthetic indicator, people in need. We have 167 million people in need in the world in 2020. An indicator that is an aggregate of many indicators, the number of refugees, displaced persons, people suffering from acute malnutrition, etc. This profusion of numbers is taking place against the backdrop of a new deployment of technologies, institutions and narratives on the importance of numbers in global governance. The UN is pursuing a policy of data revolution, evidence-based humanitarianism, and humanitarian action based on needs assessment, statistical monitoring projects, etc. And so this is on the assessment of needs and the statistics and the profusion of that. What interests me in this narrative is not just a technical discourse, but it's also a moral discourse, philosophical, ethical, and anthropological. Statistical calculation must make humanitarian not only more efficient, but also more transparent, more rational, and finally fairer. This is why it's very difficult to oppose this discourse, to resist the permanent injunction to produce figures. Whoever criticizes OCHA's figures, or even the tools of quantification in a more general way, is often accused of immorality, relativism, and obscurantism, etc. And so all of this research work consists to try to separate the technical side from the issue of the morality. And so on what occasions do humanitarian players, the NGOs, and the experts have tied together these issues between the technical side and the moral side? When we get interested in this issue, when I ask why there are more and more figures in this, we are confronted by two hypotheses. The first is it's the bureaucratization of humanitarian aid through the use of statistics. It's something like Michael Bonnet. And what he said, between the past 50 years, humanitarian aid has become increasingly professional over the last 50 years. We have seen an increase in standards, specific knowledge, professionalization of careers, rationalization of organizations, and the turning into science of knowledge, which has made the figures evolve. There's, of course, some truth in this analysis. There has indeed been an institutionalization of humanitarian aid, an increase in organizations, budgets and number of personnel, the professionalization of humanitarian works, specialized training, university courses, a regularity that makes it possible to anticipate a little. And so the problem is that it's very optimistic reading. It's a very optimistic reading that does not take into account perverse effects of quantification, their costs, their growth at the expense of other forms of knowledge, their ability to produce reports, and they are misused or misunderstood. This perspective also masks the poor quality of humanitarian figures, or at least of certain figures, which are the product of estimates as much as calculations. And the second hypothesis we find in the reading is what we might call that of Michel Foucault, that there are more and more figures because we find ourselves in more and more in neoliberal governance by the actors, by the players. So this reading starts from the premise, and this is echoed by other authors like Béatrice Hibou, Didier Fassin, and Jennifer Eidman, which shows that corresponds to an attempt of control of humanitarian sphere by the economic sphere. It's a denaturizing of the humanitarian sphere. And indeed, it's very clear that we saw the humanitarian provide a lot of technical aspects to the governments and be able to meet their needs. Then, so we are often met by, there's also more competition between the NGOs and also the donors and also the beneficiaries. So this reading is reading, but it doesn't enable us to see the internal contradictions in humanitarian organizations. It hides the actors' room for maneuver and the differences between organizations, the differences between good and bad statistical tools. It considers the humanitarian as a whole, and it struggles to account for the conflicts that cross this field. In a certain way, when we read and discuss with people who produce the figures, the nutritionists, the epidemiologists, and the specialists in refugee camps, and also the agencies in the field like the UNHCR, which provides the statistics, but they often don't even try to hide the difficulties they encounter in producing figures. Their lack of knowledge of certain areas, certain factors, their lack of access to certain regions, changes in definitions that make comparability difficult. And so what we want to do is look at the works. So what am I proposing is a different reading of humanized quantification, is to look at the way in which it's a third hypothesis that refrains from using teleological forces external to the power of the actors. And so they tie together, they bring together the figures and the moral philosophical aspect of it. And so I'm going to give you 3 examples to give you a better idea. There's impartiality, consensus at the end. I missed the second one. So we talk about the social aspect of it. And it's what we want to try to do is to avoid value judgments. I'm going to give you some proper names in my presentation, but it's not so much I have any such and such interest in them, but it's more to give you an idea of to round out the picture of exactly what I want to talk about. And so this is the process, which are broader. So the first thing that I'm interested in is the impartiality, because it's a central value. It's all the humanitarian principles, independence, impartiality, neutrality, which is probably the least fought against by the NGOs throughout the world, and also used by states when they get involved in humanitarian aid. Impartiality is defined in the conduct code of the ICRC of 1994, the Red Cross, and it's defined in 2 different ways. The first is to say that impartiality is the lack of discrimination. The first sentence is that humanitarian has no consideration of race, beliefs, or nationality. And that, I mean, that because that's very close to equality. The second provision is the priorities in terms of only needs. It's what is called proportionality. And it is calculated. It's calculated on the basis of individual needs and according to their order of urgency. Whereas the first proposal, and the sound is fading again. So the quantification of needs and moral also has its technical side. And that has been put forward by OCHA. What was less known is about this idea of impartiality. The ICRC after the Second World War got involved with it. It was Jean Pictet who worked for the Red Cross on the doctrine of the Red Cross in the 1950s, who invented proportionality of aid. A principle of equality, quantitative equality, quantitative inequity. And so the available aid will be distributed according to the relative importance of individual needs and according to their order of urgency. He thus introduces triage, a technique he borrowed from military medicine into humanitarian law. For Pictet, charity goes through science. He invented a link between the quantification and impartiality, so he transformed an old principle of the 19th century of Henri Dunant and the Red Cross in the beginning, which was to say that suffering was subjective, visible, obvious, and immeasurable, to that of the 20th century, in which suffering is called a need, a partly hidden, unknown, and become an object of scientific knowledge, comparisons, and calculations. At the time when Pictet proposed this definition, it was far from unanimous, particularly because this position was used by the ICRC to justify an overhanging position, an overarching position in relation to the National Red Cross Societies. In the 1950s, the ICRC was strongly criticized by the National Red Cross Societies because of its ambiguous role during the Second World War. Its lack of denunciation of fascism, of colonialism, and for some, by the lack of denunciation of communism. Tandis East Germany, for example, etc., and they didn't denounce the communism and colonialism. The principle of proportionality of relief thus gives the ICRC a weapon to justify its moral authority. And Pictet explained that the notion of proportionality is a weapon to justify the overarching position of the ICRC. For Pictet, the only organization that can lay claim to this objective knowledge is indeed the ICRC. He explained that while religious brotherhoods prefer their co-religionists, professional communities prefer their colleagues in the same profession, and political parties their supporters. Each organization put one group of people before the others. And so what we saw with Pictet, the principle of impartiality was transformed into mathematical distribution in a fairly precise context. The second precept that something I want to, this is the idea of universality. And this goes back to the 1960s, 1970s, universality. Until the 1950s, the world was organized by the colonial empires. France was an empire. And about a third of the world's population lived in a colonized territory. However, the principle of colonization is the separation of population into two categories, Europeans on one side and the others on the other side. The colonial racism is the idea of the incommensurability of human beings. There is no need to compare the needs of one and the other. Alors, in Europe, at the beginning of the 20th century, social and health statistics made a very rapid progress. Statistics on the consumption of workers, caloric needs, epidemics, refugees began to be produced. But all this statistical apparatus carefully avoided the colonies. The colonial administration services produced very few figures. Until the 1940s, the administrative services were unable to provide the slightest statistics on the standard of living of the populations, on poverty, food, etc. in these countries. And I refer to the excellent book by Vincent Bonnecaz, La pauvreté au Sahel, on this issue. So from the situation the African states inherited independence in the 1960s, there was a great effort in the 1960s to build a statistical apparatus to study demography, household consumption, poverty, etc. And so there were surveys in the field of the needs of the people in the field. So I'll take the example. I use the MUAC as an example, the upper arm circumference, which is an indicator of acute malnutrition in children under 5. The plastic band is wrapped around the child's arm, and a color code indicates the level of nutrition. Green for normal, yellow for acute malnutrition, and red for severe acute malnutrition. The brachial circumference is recommended as an indicator of acute malnutrition by the WHO, UNICEF, and the World Food Programme. And they use all the standards of children from 1 to 5 years old, less than 11.5 centimeters to define severe acute malnutrition, and less than 12.5 for moderate acute malnutrition. The MUAC was invented in the 1960s. by Dr. Derek Jellife, a British tropical doctor, and he tried to compare the malnutrition in various countries, what we call the third world. But the problem with malnutrition is it leads to very different symptoms in different societies and individuals. Patients have a very different ways of reacting to a lack of food. And this creates different kinds of pathologies, and there might be variations in the pathologies. The environment, which they can vary, genetics, the age and activity of the person, the environment in which they live, both in terms of environmental hygiene and climate, and exposure to infections and parasites. Jellife therefore tried to identify symptoms that were the same everywhere in order to be able to compare nutrition in different parts of the world. Clinical symptoms, biochemical symptoms, anthropometric, like the clinical symptoms like the loss of hair, the pigmentation of hair and skin, edemas, and mental disorders. And there are biochemical signs, symptoms, and anthropometric indicators. Weight, height, skin fold of the triceps, the perimeter, the circumference of the head, circumference of the chest, and the circumference of the arm. Jennifer always used these indicators together. It gave an overarching view of the indicators that allowed to diagnose malnutrition. During the Biafra War, the International Committee of the Red Cross used the upper arm circumference technique and made it the sole criterion for defining acute malnutrition. This use of upper arm circumference provoked a very critical reaction from many doctors. The sensitive question was that of thresholds. Should the same thresholds be used for all countries or different thresholds? At the time, the threshold to define at the time a Polish standard was used. The threshold used was calculated in relation to the average upper arm circumference of children in Warsaw schools, for which Jellife had the figures. Jellife's definition of malnutrition was that the child was severely malnourished if its upper arm circumference reached less than 80% of a healthy Polish child. Other doctors rejected the universal standard and advocated regional or racial standards that were called for as they were called at the time. It is understandable that such a solution was unacceptable to the World Health Organization. The definition of malnutrition could not be differentiated according to race. So again, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. Such allusions using race for each sections of the world was unacceptable for the World Health Organization coming out of the colonial period. And could not be differentiated according to race. A universal standard was thus maintained, but the proportion of the standard used to define acute malnutrition was adapted. And have a look at the table to see. We see that the upper arm circumference has changed a lot since. A child of 12 years old has to be under 30 centimeters to be considered suffering from moderate acute malnutrition, and 13. But it came down. It came down to a perimeter of 11.5 in the Cameroon in 2015.
So this universality issue is not settled at all. The third moral value I'd like to discuss is consensus, which is one of the value that is most commonly found in the humanitarian statistics. That is peace amongst our NGOs. The Sphere project is a good example of how important the consensus has become on the statements about figures. Sphere is a guideline, that's the 2000 version, which includes a humanitarian charter and a series of technical standards with figures and indicators allowing the service providers to see that they reach the minimum acceptable in a crisis situation. So 15 liters of water per person per day, 2,100 calories of food per person, including 12% of protein, 15% of fat, and at least 250 grams of soap per month, etc. There are many other standards that of HCR, of UNICEF, OCHA, and the idea of consensus is always the basis of these guidelines. The original idea of Sphere was to be like the ISO for humanitarian action. Nicholas Stockton, who used to work at Oxfam, and Peter Walker, who was working for the International Federation of the Red Cross, was to improve the humanitarian aid quality by offering standards based on figure with cutoff to provide quality help, a kind of guarantee for the donors and for the beneficiaries, meaning that if an NGO was not reaching these cutoff values, it would not deserve international financing. In the narrative of Walker and Stockton, of the Sphere project, the idea was the following. That is the rationale. First and foremost, the Sphere project was compiling the lay of the land, that is, the best standards accepted by the scientific community. And in the second stage, since they had the best standard, they would ask NGOs to sign a document by which the NGOs would make a pledge to comply with these standards. Initially, Walter and Stockton even thought that these standards would be approved by the donors, the UN member states, and even by the General Assembly of the United Nations to endow it with a legal status. Now, the core of the narrative, it was that science would provide figures, and since the figures are objective, we will all agree on those. That is, scientific knowledge should drive consensus. Now, when we look closely at the way the project was set up, it's not what we see. There is no ideal separation between science on the one side and NGOs on the other side. What we observe when we go through the archives of the Sphere and the mailings between the Sphere people and the experts, that is more than 650 experts from various organizations who were consulted, this is not a single ticket between scientific research and NGOs. There were criticisms, debates, discussions, back and forth, proposals, counter-proposals, and arguments. For instance, on the food intake, the minimum food intake, as measured per calorie, one suggested 1,900 kilocalories per person per day for people in a refugee camp. Then another suggested 2,300. Another NGO expert suggested 2,070. ICRC recommended 2,400. The final version was a 2,100 kilocalories per person per day. Interestingly, in all these emails is that the scientific arguments are never disconnected from the political, religious, and cultural arguments. That is, the ones that are at the basis of power relations between NGOs, because they might say that if you pick this cutoff, we would be criticized by another NGO, and if we use this threshold, it will not be realistic, and the donors will not accept it. Now, are these standards scientifically based? Well, yes, because most of these experts would refer to scientific papers, scientific articles, but they're not 100% scientific. Doesn't mean that they're arbitrary, but in their decisions, experts would come up with scientific arguments and political arguments to defend their view. I will now summarize. For the last years, there has been a wave of digits and figures produced by NGOs, by humanitarian organizations, and all these overload of figures is certainly resulting from bureaucratization, red tape, and streamlining or rationalizing of humanitarian aid because they help to make a decision on a large scale. They're also the result of a neoliberal governance or an attempt by donors to control humanitarian aid by using quantification techniques. But our excessive trust in figures also comes from humanitarian organizations and operators themselves. It's also the result of the ideological work produced by NGOs or humanitarian organizations themselves that are endowing the figures with a moral value. We think that we like figures because they are efficient, and it's not the case. We appreciate figures because they are reassuring us. They're like a moral instrument. And I will stop here so that we can start a debate. My first question deals with the last part of your presentation on sphere. You've used the first version of the sphere consensus. There have been several updates of their versions afterwards. Do you have any idea how these various versions were set up? And do you know whether there were other negotiations that have resulted in other standards, and how these standards have evolved and changed under the pressure of which dynamic processes? I did indeed looked into the first guideline, the first guidelines produced by Sphere in 1996 after the Rwanda crisis, which was valid up until the year 2000. And there were hectic debates in 1997 and 1998. What is striking is that they have changed the Sphere project based on the criticism. Initially, it was very ambitious. The intention was to make it legal instruments to be approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And eventually, they downsized the project, and it resulted in something different. Namely, because of all the criticisms. Michaël, I can't see you anymore. But I'm here, says Michael. So, the rationale behind Sphere was that they would either discredit the criticism, ignore them. The French letter, for instance, written in September 1998 by MSF, Médecins du Monde, Doctors of the World, François Grunewald and others, criticizing the Sphere project, which has resulted in downsizing the project with proposals which were far less binding the initial ones. Organization standard, for instance, were defined in a given chapter at the beginning in the first version of the manual, and then it was removed. So there were lengthy negotiations upstream, and then after each version of the manual. The first questions are coming in. I'll give the floor to Bertrand and then Eric Sangar. Please introduce yourself when you take the floor. Bertrand Tête. I'm a member of the Scientific Council of Crash in Manchester. Could you please, Joël, talk again about the political and moral value of figures, facts and figures, the statistics? Because when we talk about the Sphere project, it seems like there was a counter campaign after the mistakes made by humanitarian organization in Goma. And it seems that when you read Peter Walker, it seems that the figures are becoming like the Holy Grail. And he kind of used figures as a way to have a pure expertise, and he made an analogy with the aerospace industry, and to him the only way to analyze failures was to use statistics and figures. It's in your book indeed, and you've talked about it in your introductory speech, but I think that it can help us feed our thinking about the fact that we have kind of a hubris on figures and statistics. Well, indeed, the political aspect and the rejection of political aspect, rejecting debate and discussion is very important in Sphere, but not only in this project, because with Stockton and Walker, it's right from the beginning, they have a kind of fad for ISO, technical standards, and so on and so forth, thinking that they would protect NGOs in a political setting where after the Rwanda crisis, there was a huge pressure on from donors who said, either you put some order in the house or we will do that. And indeed, figures and statistics were seen as a way to protect NGOs. And there was an internal program was to put some order in the humanitarian world between Oxfam, CARE, and others, and also to show to the small humanitarian organizations to show them who were the leaders. But interestingly, I think that it's beyond Sphere. We may hope that one day we will escape this politicization and this fear of debate and conflict and argument is something that you can also find at UN OCHA when they provide the need assessment overview with an instrument which is a software. It's an algorithm which helps to compile and aggregate statistical data, and the guideline on the software says that it's an average value comparing the importance between the number of displaced, malnourished children, number of refugees, how you're going to compare these various plights. And the guideline of this algorithm tells that you have to provide a mathematical average value and that everything should be on an equal level to avoid any debate between NGOs. So I say, this is the average, this is the cutoff, and everybody should be performing their work accordingly. So they're obsessed with consensus. And that's why figures and statistics are very useful. I'll give the floor to Eric Sangar. We met recently with Eric, and I will ask him to ask his questions and respond, and maybe also to respond and introduce the project that has helped us to meet recently. And then we have Claire Potin on our list. My name is Eric Sangar. I'm an academic at Sciences Po Lille and a member of the data work project involving the French National Agency of Research with other scholars. And indeed, recently we had a discussion with Michaël and Fabrice Weissman and some ICRC members, as well as members of Handicap International, because our project delves into the use of quantitative data in conflict settings, not only humanitarian emergency, but particularly in armed conflict settings, and how this data is produced by NGOs themselves and scholars, and how they have their influence on our interpretation of conflicts. So we also look at the figures that are produced by the media and the military. And I'd like to thank you, Joël, for this fascinating presentation, because as I started my research, I came across your research. My question in relation to our project is increasingly when analyzing armed conflicts, there is a kind of attempt to predict, to forecast, to have early warning systems of potential conflicts. And I was wondering whether there were similar trends observed in humanitarian action. I would like to know if there are other operators who are trying to produce forecast or early warning signs of potential emergency situations and recommend action before the worst situation occurs. And if so, what are the causal assumptions that you have taken? Are there any theories on how the emergency situations emerge? What are the drivers of these humanitarian situations? Or do they only limit themselves to descriptive statistics that do not allow for the causality of these events? Joël? Thank you for your question. Honestly, I don't know. François Antenne has produced very interesting work on the early warnings in Ethiopia and IPC in the nutrition crisis, how to anticipate famines. And this is an interesting work for Ethiopia with what was done in 2016 with figures which were criticized because the figures and the data and the algorithms could not be checked on site in the field. Maybe you can answer this, Michael? Well, I'll pick up on this question about the early warning indicators in case of famine and malnutrition. I think that the IPC and FUSE craftsmen have recognized the limits of their models, particularly for countries where there are conflicts. We've worked on Yemen last year because there were repeated famine alerts with figures, very general figures, saying that people would be the victims of malnutrition based on the, rule of thumb kind of calculations, I would say. And we looked into the way the indicators were developed, but the access of surveyors was so limited that the data that they were providing was quite flimsy, but it was used as a tool for a statement to mobilize aid. So it's a complement to what Joël has said and a kind of answer to Eric's question, because these predictive tools and have shown their limits in the areas where we supposedly needed them. And Anne Maxwell, who is one of the developers of these tools, has expressed an honest criticism on whether these tools could help the humanitarian organizations in the field. No, IPC, comment of IPC, one of the very official statement of IPC is to create a consensus. That's their statement. Now I will give the floor to Claire. Claire Potin, please introduce yourself, and then I will read the questions that were sent to us by on the Vimeo chat. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm sorry, Joël, I haven't read your book, but I did appreciate your presentation and your assumptions. I was expecting a third assumption, and maybe my question, or maybe the answer to my question is in your book. I've understood the red tape, professionalization of humanitarian aid, resulting in producing more data and statistics, and too much quantification, too much quantity, not enough quality, in my view, and the weight of operational research and publishing articles, so much so that we have preferred areas here and there, and we have evidence-based data. And do you discuss this in your book? No, I'd like to pick up on Claire's question, if I may. Because in your book, Joël, you mentioned that you worked a bit with MSF Switzerland in Cameroon. There are some chapters in your book that are dedicated to some missions and fields that are providing support to refugees in Cameroon, and that's led by MSF Switzerland. So I'd like to know, what is your view on the data produced by MSF itself, and what is your view on the data that MSF has produced and generated, and the data produced by others in the same setting? I didn't work with MSF Switzerland. I just asked them questions. I interviewed people and specialists in the field, and I didn't work with MSF Switzerland. I just interviewed some MSF Switzerland people. So in Cameroon, MSF had a kind of a particular role, and maybe they will answer Claire's question. There were the warning system when Epicentre produced mortality data in 2015 when the Central African refugees started to cross the border and the mortality rates in the eastern part of Cameroon were very high. And Epicentre, flagged it, and they had a retrospective mortality data survey with an estimate showing that the thresholds were far, the mortality, child mortality was too high. And there was a strong criticism of HCR data. HCR was withdrawing from Cameroon to move elsewhere, to Syria, in other regions, and therefore there was a lot of criticism based on the figures because there was a delay in the response provided by HCR. So there is a competition in the production of statistics and data, bearing in mind that Cameroon didn't put itself in a situation where it would put figures. Ethiopia and Rwanda, for instance, do produce a lot of data. Cameroon produces very little statistics. So here again, there is a mutual criticism of organizations. But once the warning was made, HCR came in and started regular smart surveys at a wider scale with UNICEF and other UN agencies.
Claire? Does that answer your question, Claire? Are we obliged to pass through the quantitative just because of a need to publish? That was also part of my question. The need to publish in the among your hypotheses linked to bureaucratization and the professionalisation and also the donors. It's a way to control what's going on. And so the question I want to ask is, are we not moving toward a kind of weightlifting, because the data that we gather, is it to try and prove something? To be able to launch an operation, and I don't know if in your book you tackle that, not directly, but the notion of témoignage, and to be able to make specific observations. was sort of touched on in one of my chapters, but not directly. There is a thesis by Brendan Lowson, part of the British media, who worked on the figures and the relationships with the media, and which the news organizations produce figures, and I find that was a very interesting study. And so we have two questions that have come to us through the chat. Question from Pierre. Is there existence of tensions and a difference? This is a question which is recurrent in our debates in the field. Is there a tension and difference between the French-speaking organizations and the English-speaking organizations on the use of these figures? And the English have a reputation of using more figures. And the second question from Henry Macias. I'm working on the practice of data gathering in a Jordan refugee camp. Have you been able to study the production of data? I haven't really got a specific answer I can give to that, but the English, the tension between the English organizations and the English-speaking organizations and the French-speaking organizations, it's very difficult to say. But what I see in this sphere, in the example I gave you, that there difference between them. We talked a lot, the difference and the rivalry between the English speakers and the French speakers. And perhaps Sammy can say something about that. But the reasoning of the profession with specialized NGOs and the reasoning of niches and the reason for which MSF and MDM and the French NGOs have opposed these statistics because in the areas where MSF was working at the time, in the conflict situations, for example, but it was derisory to use these standards. So it was more a matter of specialization, the technical side, rather the way we see the world, rather than a cultural point of view, French-speaking or English-speaking. Like the ICRC, went very much on MSF's side in the situation, not just for diplomatic reasons, but these are positions were not necessarily relevant to the decision. Concerning the local employees about data creation, it's very important in Cameroon, for example, in the nutritional surveys that that I followed, almost all the people who produced the SMART surveys, these are local employees, both in local health workers in the Cameroon, and also worked hand in hand with MSF in the situation. And so there again, there's a kind of a division here which wasn't all that evident. In the narratives that the experts held, we didn't have the feeling, but we have to work on it, I think. But I didn't have the impression that there was a big difference in diagnosis or a big difference between the different professions according to the branch of medicine one was working in. And the professions were working in logistics or medical or supply, etc. I don't know if I've really answered your question, but we spoke with my colleague Fabrice, who is in Mali at the moment, and he shared with us the work, the anthropological work devoted to the mediation of the national staff in data production. And there's a bibliography that exists on that, which is not very complete, but it makes it possible to measure the particular role played by of these individuals, as Joël says, who are in fact, in reality, are in charge of producing statistics, humanitarian statistics, and this is the same case as in Yemen. When we talked earlier about of the IPCs, or the people who are in charge of gathering statistics in the field, we notice very quickly that we have a difficult time of separating the production of the figures and their role in the society and their political and social roles when we ask them to do the job. In cases like that, we have to distinguish between the professions who work with the Ministry of Health for the NGOs or the volunteers who are busy at work. And what do you mean by local? In a country like Cameroon, the international organizations or the people who are working for refugees are Cameroonies, but coming from different areas of the countries, and they come from different social structures. So the idea of the local humanitarian workers is true, but we have to define really specifically what we mean by local. This enables us once again to denaturalize the idea of statistics and to talk more about the context in which the norms and standards are produced at headquarters, but also the data gathering. And so I'd make an appeal. Perhaps we have colleagues at Epicenter who are listening to us. If they'd like to react, please don't hesitate. And they would be most welcome. And so I want to give the floor back to Bertrand. And then we will go to Haiti because we have a question that comes from Haiti. So Bertrand? On the question when we come back of the culture of statistics, I think there's a difference between the multi-mandate organizations which have a culture which is both humanitarian and developmental, and in development, and also a political culture insofar as the major donors of the states, like the Tony Blair organization, are obsessed by statistics. There's an obsession with the quantitative, about measuring progress in a kind of political ideology of Blairism early in the 2000s, and it left a very deep-running trace because we saw the passage, mandatory passage between the governments and organizations, Oxfam and Save the Children, for example, and some people spend. Some of these people spent some time in the office of the Prime Minister and went off to work with Save the Children. So you have political, cultural aspects of it which are broader. But my question has more to do not just on data gathering, but also possessing the figures and the data. It's kind of the grand. It's also a part of the machine. There's also a culture of secrecy of the figures, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit more on that, insofar as humanitarian workers do not share their statistics. I really kind of come back to this question. It's a good question, but. This issue of the secrecy of data, but what data is used and what is not used, what figures figure in the debate, and others which are not noticed. And we're surprised by that sometimes you have the figures are hidden, not because they depend on secrecy, because they are lost in an avalanche of figures, and they are not noticed because they're drowned by so many other figures that surround them. And so you have an idea of secrecy, it's true, but it's not necessarily only because of secrecy that there is this contrast between the ideology of transparency and sharing the data, but I don't think there really is necessarily purely due to secrecy that the data isn't shared. But I notice the difference between political culture but I'm not sure about our government in France is less obsessed with figures than Tony Blair's in the early 2000s. Because Tony gave us a lot of money. And so now off to Haiti. And after that, we'll return to France and give the floor to Roni. I'm Jean-Pierre Caposo in Haiti, but I come from the DRC, actually. And I followed with a lot of intention your presentation, which I found very interesting. I would like to about the reliability of the data. We had a study where we did a study on with the OCHA humanitarians and other humanitarians like MSF, and we found ourselves in the field, and we observed that the people who do the surveys in the field I personally, I observed that there was information lacked on training of the surveyors, because I met surveyors who did a study on the thieves of work, and there were surveyors who gave them to NGOs who were looking for a source of funding. As a result, the data was manipulated, and it didn't really reflect reality in the field. And so I don't know what Joël Glasman would advise us to overcome this obstacle. How can we distinguish between the people who carry out the surveys from your past, from your experience? What advice could you give to be able to properly produce data and to be able to bypass this manipulation of data? Joël, so perhaps Roni might have something to say about that. Joël, first of all, my first answer is that I'm an historian, and they are very bad at giving advice about the future. I'm more curious about asking questions rather than proffering solutions. I have no solutions to offer. It might be a bit disappointing to hear that, but there seems to be three pathways in the book that I laid out. The first, we have to take the statistics serious. That is, take the profession of statistic gathering very seriously, and to be able to rely on the experts, as long as they are honest about the limitations of their models. But also we have to take seriously other methodologies which are always there in surveys, but gradually disappear, where the methodology part becomes more abstract. And we have to take the people who gather these statistics seriously. The second pathway that we might adopt, that is building serious statistics, the work like that of Bertrand Tête, and the criticism of the figures, and also to be able to forearm ourselves against the manipulation of figures. And the third pathway would be to say, to open yourselves to other kind of evidence. Don't leave the words evidence or data or knowledge, and don't reduce them to an expression of pure statistics. Today, humanitarian by evidence, we talk only about statistics nowadays, which is a bit of a caricature, because the data can also express many other things. But the operational advice I might be able to give, that's the reason I'm doing this, but I leave this work to other people because I'm more an historian. So, Roni? Can you hear me? Yes. The last question which was asked, first of all, I would like to thank Joël for this very interesting presentation. Unfortunately, I haven't yet read his book, and so my question will not be in relation to his book itself, which I haven't read yet. But I did observe, as a player and an observer, that we often make a contrast between the clearness, the clarity of the figures, and how many figures come after the dot, and also the vagueness of the way they are constituted. And most of the time, we don't properly define the cases, or we don't define the situation, and people find themselves with figures. When you talk about the mortality rate, for example, that can be observed in areas where very highly effective areas like the Congo or in the Horn of Africa, And these are figures which are repeated year after year. The IPC we talked about, they are manipulated. Because these are the kind which are the most significant, and with the disparity between the statistics and the percentages, etc., the malnutrition rate, and then the vagueness in which these figures are constituted. I have no remedy to that, but as Joël said, but I'm caught up in a crisis of conscience, which goes well beyond the theoretical complexity, because there is permanently a manipulation of figures to such a degree that the first sensible reaction when the figures are given in a situation is to say, why he said this, what does that prove, and what are they saying to us? The moral mobilization that is involved with it is one of a major challenge for the humanitarians in the Horn of Africa on a regular basis. So it's rather more a remark and a reaction to the question about the falseness. Very often we mustn't generalize in this field, but often we have the figures, the statistics carry us away. It seems to me a problem that has to be asked. All the people killed in the Congo or in Darfur. But I want to conclude on a remark on impartiality. I like the presentation on impartiality. I thought it was very well expressed. But just to indicate that the moment when this becomes a cardinal principle, where it becomes a kind of something which is enshrined, we have to denounce the fundamental precepts of the Red Cross, which participates in an operation of image building, or the criticisms which are leveled against it. Also, in relation to the post-colonial, the colonial commitment by the ICRC in Asia, and so we have a lot of things to be forgiven for, and I think and it is working like a kind of phrase. We were bowing down to the governments in power, rather than treating humanitarian cases. And so that's the end of my remarks. So thank you, Ronnie. To return to this question about the sincerity of the figures and their gathering, to talk more a little bit about Ethiopia, Joël, you talked about the work by François Antenne on the local figure gathering. François' works is very instructive, and we can refer to this work. And aligned with that, there was a colleague, Marianne, in Ethiopia in 2016. It seemed to me that who was coordinating the project and who bore witness in Chad as well about the difficulty of the team itself to be able to have trust in the method of data gathering, including their own data, making the operations very difficult to carry out. And so we were swimming in a kind of fog that we talked about earlier. And so here I want to come back to the question by Benjamin. I'm not completely convinced that I have an answer myself, but we could try to come to a response by asking the following question. You talked about the external impact of the quantitative aspect in témoignage, and we talked about the internal ONGs. What role does it play internally in NGOs? The attention paid to the data, in this rationale of consensus. I wonder if, Joël, you have any reflections to share on that issue. It's a vast question, I kind of want to say that it's up to the crash to pose that kind of question. But it's very interesting. Ronnie Borman mentioned the issue about the production of figures and the manipulation of figures on a big level. There's a small policy of figures. I think within each organization there are debates and conflicts and a competition between the different professions, between the professionals themselves. With an adjunction, and you said that, but what figures that you're using, if I say I have figures which show one thing, and this fuels the internal fights between the professions, perhaps you could fill out, Michaël, what you mean a little bit. But I see governance of the university every day. The fight between the statistics is a fight between the various sectors and aspects of the university, and perhaps we find the same thing within the NGOs. No, I haven't got a lot to add to that. I want to carry on with the question from Clément Perrin, who asked if the rationale of quantified standards doesn't come from the donors to compare the various organizations. That is to find the organization which is the most efficient, and also to be able to make their funding. And it might be a means for the donors to do some benchmarking between the NGOs before deciding which organization they're going to contribute to. And it's possible that the British experience by Bertrand might be able to educate us a little bit in understanding this question. I think that is entirely true and demonstrable. It's the principle of governmentality. Governmentality is to not start to go directly to the NGOs that one wants to go to, but we have a certain amount of money, and may the best person win, and they put the NGOs in competition, one against the other, and then we look at it more afterwards. And those are some of the principle of the governance, liberal governance, which functions very well, because the competition in which we participate, we cannot get away from it, especially among the media, because everybody is constrained by figures. They agree that the figures aren't perfect, but in the end, that's about the only thing we have to judge ourselves by. But what I'm in the process of doing, I know that the call for contracts is something which the donors indeed use. It's a technique of neoliberal governments. It's a classic tool that they use, as we've seen in the past. Bertrand, would you like to add something? There are substantial examples that we've seen. Merlin, for example, it's an organization which went bankrupt financially at the moment when it was growing. And one of the reasons for its failure was the fact that to be able to preposition themselves for the call for tenders, they implemented an infrastructure which enabled it to offer projects and accumulate the data, which enabled them to be able to take in call for tenders. And the structure became too expensive in relation to the return on it. And at the time, they wanted to diversify the number of partners, to put them in competition, and Maryland went bankrupt. It seems to me that we can see that there's a kind of rationale of this governmentality worked and led to overcosts, and a part of those was to generate a call for tenders. And it was based on the production of data. And I think you can see a kind of a vicious circle. Moreover, with the spirit of the competition, that is value for money, which is a part of the criteria, there was another one, which was the fact that the organizations like the FIE suggested it would fund with a goal of developing a theory of change. And the theory of change is also funded not from aid, but a transformative aid. And so it had to calculate and it had to present not only what we've done, but what we were going to do to move toward this change. And there you're in a production of data which is fairly futuristic. I don't know how else to express that. We're getting involved in a narrative which is completely science fiction. So I want to continue before the next question by saying, to ask you, Joël, to react to a comment made within MSF, which we often make. We often observe that it's more and more difficult to propose a project without beforehand confirmed through the data built by the ACF, taken from an external source, and much more critical of the data produced by in-house. And and MSF is not spared from this this evidence-based information. It's more not about the social aspect of it, but the descriptive aspect of it, and to inform, despite everything, which seems to be more and more insufficient to be able to make choices, especially in operational terms. And so I wanted to look at a little bit, but is there something within the framework of your dialogue with the players and the aid players that you've met during your work, and perhaps if within the framework of discussions like this one, we have begun an update of these figures. We know how seductive they can be, these figures, to the whole sector. And so what critical view can the players that you have discussed this with, what's their point of view? And to what degree they look at all that? And is there a beginning of a critical attitude toward the figure, or are we still in this blind and over-quick production of data? I kind of want to be even more pessimistic. The criticism of the figures and the clearness of the figures that exists ever since the 19th century. There's always been a criticism, internal criticism, and we're not just discovering that now. It's not the criticism which is going to cause this rush forward for statistics, but it has existed for a long time. That the criticism, for example, of the MUAC have been around for a long time, but it hasn't aged very much. We could repeat today that the humanitarianism is based on figures, and it's a matter of conscience as well. This problem, it's a very important problem of these figures. You said that how can we validate the descriptions and other informational modes? And I think people are starting to do that a little bit, and also the professional experience and the knowledge held by the professions and by many organizations. I don't know when Epicenter was founded, but in Geneva, for example, with Lars Peterson, which produces data to control the OCHA statistics and other organizations which are beginning to emerge and also produce their statistics. I think this internal criticism exists, but I'm not sure that's enough.
Back to Roni for the following question. We can't hear you. Microphone. 2 to 3 things I'd like to say. I did express this wish in a few articles that the sociologists, demographers, statisticians could play this role of assessing, monitoring the figures. And I said, this is something to be wished. It does exist, but it's not so widely used with more authority and better grounded. And I think it should become more institutionalized. Don't see any other way to raise the standard, so to speak, and it would make things better. And to pick up on what Joël said, Epicenter was set up in 1984-85 in a setting at MSF, which were not that simple. And this has helped MSF to become a major player amongst those collecting and producing data. So we've been involved in this since the beginning of the 1980s. And regarding the policy of the theory of change at DFID, isn't it a new name for or an obsolete word, which was development aid, social transformation, which was part of the sum of the theories of development aid. I think that we'll come to the conclusion of this conference. I'd like to mention a question which may be drifting from the focus. T3 is talking about a performance-based premium which grants funds to medical entities and medical staff based on their overall performance. It's the case in some countries. And we also know, and my experience has shown me that humanitarian organizations or relief organizations, including MSF, are not always far from this policy of performance-based premium. I think it means that we're setting a performance indicator in a setting of neoliberal competition. And T3 is asking whether the risk-benefit ratio of such practices have already been discussed. It's not really the focus of Joël's work, but producing data to assess the overall performance will sometimes prevail and will be the driver of relief operations. I don't know, Joël, if you want to add something about that. Well, pretty soon, I'm afraid, they will be faced with manipulation of figures. It reminds me of the time when the colonial administrators were completely putting fake figures in their report, showing that there was a high number of people who were vaccinated and that their dispensaries were working well, etc. It will be difficult to manage, but we will have to observe this. But it seems to me that it will be rather complex to manage this. Well, thank you. I don't see any more questions in our list. And I will be concluding this conference. I'd like to thank you, Joël, for this debate and for this very first virtual meeting. Everybody stuck to the rules of virtual meetings. I'm always the one coming up with the conclusions of the conferences, so I will stick to my old habits. I will strongly encourage you to read this book should the opportunity arise, or take the opportunity, and maybe at MSF we will probably keep on having this dialogue with Joël in the coming months. Thank you very much, Joël. Thank you, everybody. There won't be any drinks served afterwards, but nothing should prevent you from having a drink at home. Bye-bye. Goodbye. Thank you. Thank you, Michaël. Goodbye.